Get this trash off my plane! Victoria, Ashworth shrieked, and she was actually clapping both hands coming together in sharp little cracks of sound like she was applauding a performance that had finally reached its satisfying conclusion. The clapping was what Layla Okafor would remember longest. Not the hand around her arm, not the moment her phone skidded across the cabin floor and disappeared under the seat in front of her. Not even the sound of the aircraft door beginning its slow hydraulic swing toward closed. It was the clapping. The deliberate, delighted, performative clapping of a woman in a fur coat standing at the entrance to a first-class cabin in the middle of July, watching a teenage girl get dragged out of a seat she had paid for and finding it worthy of applause. The gate agent's name was Darnell Webb, and his hand was wrapped completely around Layla's upper arm, his fingers pressing in deep enough that she could feel the pressure against the bone beneath her skin. He was a large man, well over 200 pounds, and he had grabbed her with the casual confidence of someone who had been told there was a problem and had arrived to solve it without asking a single question about the nature of the problem first. He yanked upward, hauling her out of seat 1A with enough force that her messenger bag swung off her shoulder and hit the armrest, and she stumbled sideways into the aisle, one hand catching the headrest just in time to keep herself from going down completely. Her phone was gone. She had been mid-call when Darnell grabbed her the phone held in her left hand with 2 fingers while she tried with the other hand to show her boarding pass one more time. And when his grip closed around her arm, the phone simply flew, clattered to the floor. In that particular way that phones do when they hit aircraft carpet, a flat slapping sound, and slid forward, spinning once before disappearing under the seat where Bryn Calloway's foot was already waiting. The flight attendant didn't kick it hard. She didn't have to. Just a precise little nudge with the toe of her heel, almost casual, almost bored, like she was moving a piece of trash out of the aisle so passengers wouldn't trip. And then she looked up at Layla with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to one to make Layla's stomach turn, and said, "We'll have it mailed to you, sweetheart." Bryn Calloway was platinum blonde, 43 years old, and had been working first-class cabins for Horizon Air for 12 years. She wore her hair pinned back on both sides in a style that the airline's grooming standards approved of, and she had the kind of face that defaulted to professional warmth so automatically that when the warmth disappeared as it had the moment she turned from the businessman in seat 2A and saw Layla standing in the aisle. The absence of it was almost louder than the warmth itself had been. She stood now with her arms crossed and her weight settled back on her heels, watching Darnell guide Layla toward the door with the satisfied stillness of someone who had identified a problem, escalated it to the appropriate personnel, and was now watching the resolution proceed according to plan. Victoria Ashworth was still clapping. She was standing in the entrance to the first-class cabin, still in her fur coat, still carrying the Louis Vuitton bag that she had been swinging like a weapon since she swept onto the aircraft 20 minutes ago. Her platinum hair was constructed into a shape that defied the July humidity, and her face was flushed with the particular triumph of a woman who was accustomed to getting what she wanted and had once again gotten it. She bounced slightly on the balls of her feet as Darnell propelled Layla down the aisle past the rows of passengers who had gone very still past the man in the navy suit in seat 1C, who had not moved but whose eyes tracked every detail of what was happening with the focused precision of someone who was memorizing rather than merely watching. Finally, Victoria announced to no one in particular, to everyone in general, letting herself drop into seat 1A with the satisfied exhale of a person claiming a throne. Some proper customer service. Layla didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward and her chin up, and she let Darnell steer her because she understood with the clarity that only comes from having been in versions of this moment 11 times before, that fighting physically would make everything worse in ways she could not afford right now. But her right hand, the hand that wasn't trapped in Darnell's grip, was moving very deliberately, opening her hoodie pocket, reaching for a second phone, the backup that her father had insisted on and that she had rolled her eyes at when he put it in her hands at the door this morning. Before the aircraft door completed its swing, she had managed to press exactly one contact. Dad. Emergency. 1 ring. 2 rings. The door sealed shut. On the jet bridge, the humid July air hit her face like a wall after the aggressive air conditioning of the cabin, and Layla blinked against the sudden brightness of the afternoon light coming through the terminal windows. Darnell's grip on her arm had loosened slightly now that they were off the aircraft. His hand still there, but less certain, the way a person's grip loosens when the adrenaline of the situation begins to drain away, and they start to actually think about what they have done. Through the terminal window down on the tarmac below Gate 31, something was wrong with the sky. There was a black jet descending at an angle that commercial traffic did not descend at, coming in fast and low with the focused trajectory of something that had been aimed, not guided, and it had a single gold letter painted on its tail. What no one on Flight 882 understood yet, not Bryn Calloway, who was already settling Victoria Ashworth into Seat 1. With a fresh glass of champagne and the warm professional smile she had withheld from Layla from the first moment she laid eyes on her, and not Darnell Webb, who was reaching for his radio to call for additional security to escort the problem out of the terminal entirely, and certainly not Victoria herself, who was adjusting the window shade and commenting to the passenger in 1B that the service on this airline had really gone downhill until today was exactly who they had put their hands on. They had looked at a small girl in a worn gray hoodie and scuffed Converse sneakers with her natural hair pulled up in a messy bun, and they had seen what they expected to see, which was a person who did not belong in Seat 1A of a first-class transatlantic cabin, and that expectation had been so immediate and so complete that no one had looked any further. They had not looked at the boarding pass that clearly showed $5,400 paid in full 3 months prior, purchased not for luxury, but for safety, because Nathaniel Okafor did not allow his daughter to fly internationally in a middle seat, next to strangers she didn't know. They had not considered that the backup phone she reached for so smoothly, without panic, with the practiced calm of someone who has been briefed for exactly this kind of emergency, was connected to a man whose company Okafor Energy Group supplied aviation fuel to 68% of every commercial airport on the eastern seaboard. And they had not noticed the man in Seat 1C across the aisle. Navy suit, physical newspaper. The kind of deliberate stillness that is not passivity but its opposite, who had been watching Layla Okafor since the moment she boarded. Not because he knew who she was, but because in 22 years on the federal bench he had learned to recognize the specific posture of a person who is managing an injustice with extraordinary self-control, and that recognition had made him set down his newspaper and begin paying very careful attention. 3 separate things were now in motion that no one aboard Flight 882 had any idea were in motion. If you've ever wondered what real power looks like when it's been pushed too far, stay with us, because what happens in the next 40 minutes is going to change the way you think about who belongs where and who decides. Subscribe to our channel right now and don't move, because you need to see every single second of what comes next. Through the terminal window at Gate 31, the tail number on the descending jet was now visible to anyone who happened to look N4-OKF, and beneath the registration number painted in gold against matte black fuselage, the single letter that anyone in East Coast aviation would have recognized immediately. The alarm on Layla Okafor's phone was set for 5:15 a.m., but she was already awake when it went off, sitting at her desk in the dark, in the Harlem brownstone where she had lived her entire life, surrounded by the organized chaos of someone who was preparing for 2 different versions of the same trip at the same time. The desk had 2 distinct personalities, and they were separated by about 8 inches of clear space in the middle. On the left side, Oxford University's pre-arrival reading list. 3 textbooks she had already begun annotating in pencil, a folder of printouts about the international law program she had been accepted to after 2 years of trying. On the right side, a manila folder containing 4 different versions of a legal argument she had been drafting for the past 3 weeks on behalf of a family in the Bronx who couldn't afford representation and whose landlord was violating housing code in 11 separate documented ways. She had been working on it since midnight. She was 19 years old. Her bedroom looked like a bedroom at first glance, a twin bed with a faded quilt her grandmother had made a narrow bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks and textbooks stacked horizontally on top of the vertically shelved ones, because there was no more room any other way. On one wall, a corkboard with a photograph pinned at the center, a woman in surgical scrubs, dark skin, natural hair pulled back, laughing at something outside the camera's frame with the full-body laughter of a person who laughed that way often. Dr. Layla Okafor, Layla's mother. Gone 3 years now from a cancer that moved faster than medicine could follow. On the shelf below the corkboard, pushed to the back like things that belong to a different version of yourself. 4 robotics competition trophies from middle school, the kind with the little gold-painted figure on top holding a gear. The kind that used to mean everything, and now just meant she had been good at something, before she discovered that what she really wanted to do was argue on behalf of people who had no one to argue for them. She heard her father before she saw him the particular soft footfall of Nathaniel Okafor moving through the house in the early morning, the sound of the kitchen, the specific click and hiss of the electric kettle that he had bought specifically because it was quieter than the old one, because even in the small economies of a morning routine, he was a man who thought about other people before himself. He appeared in her doorway with 2 mugs and he looked at the desk, both sides of it, the Oxford folder and the Bronx family's legal argument, without saying anything about either one, which was its own kind of communication between them. "Big day," he said, handing her the mug with the hot chocolate. He had been making her hot chocolate before early departures since she was 6 years old. She had never asked him to stop. "Big day," she agreed, wrapping both hands around the warmth of it. He sat on the edge of her bed, his own coffee forgotten on the nightstand, and studied her face with the particular attention of a man who had learned over 19 years to read the things his daughter didn't say. Nathaniel Okafor was 54 years old and looked 10 years younger than that, with the kind of quiet physical presence that came not from size, but from absolute stillness. He was not a large man, but he was the kind of man that rooms rearranged themselves around without quite knowing why. He wore a plain dark sweater and reading glasses he didn't need yet pushed up on his head, and he looked in this moment entirely unlike the person who had built Okafor Energy Group from a single municipal fuel contract in 1998 into the company that now supplied aviation fuel to 43 airports across the eastern seaboard. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you go quiet and your jaw does that." She touched her jaw involuntarily. He smiled. "The Oxford people," she said after a moment, turning the mug in her hands. "They don't know who you are, which is exactly how I want it. But they're also going to look at me and make assumptions before I open my mouth, and I'm going to spend the first 6 weeks proving that I belong there on my own terms, and I'm just—" She stopped. "I'm tired of that being the starting position. I'm tired of walking into rooms already behind." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing his words, not stalling. "You're not walking in behind," he said finally. "You walk in carrying everything you've already done. The Bronx family's case. The housing argument you've been building for 3 weeks. The 200 hours you put into the legal aid clinic last year alone. That's not catching up, Layla. That's arriving." She looked at him. "They need what you're bringing," he said, "not the other way around." She nodded, and she felt the knot in her sternum loosen, not entirely, but enough. The hoodie she pulled on before leaving was deliberate, and both of them knew it without discussing it. It was the same gray hoodie she wore to the legal aid clinic, to the library, to the coffee shop on 125th, where she worked on cases and no one knew or cared who her father was. And it was the version of herself she was most comfortable being. Layla Okafor from Harlem, first-generation law student, the girl who read every brief twice and argued every point until it was airtight. Not Nathaniel Okafor's daughter, not the girl from the Forbes profile 3 years ago that she had asked to have her name removed from. Her boarding pass was on her phone, seat 1, A Flight 882, Horizon Air, JFK, to Heathrow, purchased by her father 3 months ago, for $5,400 full fare, no miles, no upgrade. She had argued about it. He had been immovable. Window seat, front of the plane, 8 hours alone to read and sleep, and you don't sit next to anyone you don't know for that long. She had said it was excessive. He had said it was the minimum. She tucked the phone into her back pocket, shouldered her messenger bag, and took one last look at the corkboard. The photograph her mother, laughing the particular angle of her chin when she laughed like that, which Layla had inherited along with her hands and her stubbornness and her absolute refusal to pretend that something was fine when it wasn't. "Call when you land," Nathaniel said at the door. "Always do." She walked out into the Harlem morning, and to anyone watching from the stoops or the passing cars or the corner bodega just opening its gate for the day, she was just another young woman heading to the subway with a bag over her shoulder, wearing a gray hoodie and Converse sneakers, looking like she had somewhere to be and no particular need to announce it, which was exactly how she liked it. JFK, Terminal 4 in July had its own particular atmosphere, a kind of compressed urgency that was part summer travel madness and part the specific anxiety that airports produce in people who are already running slightly late and have too much to carry, and are about to spend several hours in a metal tube at 35,000 feet with strangers who have different ideas about armrest protocol. Layla moved through it the way she moved through most things, efficiently with her earbuds in and her head slightly down and her messenger bag held close to her body, occupying exactly the amount of space she needed and not an inch more. She had gotten to the airport 2 hours early, her father's standing rule non-negotiable, and had spent the first 40 minutes of that time in a corner of the terminal working through the final section of the Bronx family's housing argument on her laptop. And she was feeling, if not exactly calm, then at least focused in the way that having useful work to do in an anxious situation tends to produce. The priority boarding lane was completely empty when she approached it, which was the way it usually was for first-class passengers. At this hour, the lane roped off from the massive general queue with that particular combination of red velvet and chrome stanchions that is designed to signal exclusivity while maintaining the polite fiction that this is simply a matter of efficiency. Maybe 40 people snaked through the regular line behind the rope-balancing carry-ons and passports and children whose energy levels were in inverse proportion to how tired their parents looked. Layla stepped into the empty priority lane and approached the podium. The gate agent looked up. Donna Pierce was in her late 40s with dyed blonde hair cut in a precise bob that she had clearly maintained with the same regularity and commitment she brought to everything else about her appearance. And she had the practiced, efficient air of someone who had processed thousands of passengers through this exact lane and had developed over time a rapid and confident system for categorizing them. The system engaged the moment her eyes moved from Layla's face to her hoodie, to her scuffed Converse sneakers and back up again, and it delivered its verdict in approximately 3 seconds, which was the amount of time it took for the near imperceptible tightening at the corners of Donna's mouth to settle into something that wasn't quite a frown, but was its functional equivalent. "Economy boarding starts in 20 minutes, Donna said, her tone carrying the brisk efficiency of someone managing a line, the implicit message being that Layla was not the right kind of person to be standing in this particular lane, and they could both save time by acknowledging that fact immediately. "Zone 4 will be called over the PA. You'll want to wait in the main line with everyone else." She had not asked Layla's name. She had not looked at Layla's phone. She had looked at Layla's hoodie and her sneakers and made a decision. Layla had been through this exact interaction with minor variations 11 times in the past year. She had a count because she had started keeping one after the 7th time, not out of bitterness, but out of the same methodical impulse that made her document every housing code violation in the Bronx family's case, because patterns matter and patterns documented are patterns that can be argued. 11 times she had been redirected, dismissed, told she was in the wrong place by people who had made a snap judgment and were defending it. Most of the time, she just showed her ticket and moved on because making a point at every single one of these moments was exhausting. in a way that she did not have the energy budget for all the time, and because there was a particular kind of small victory in the efficiency of proving someone wrong, and then simply walking away without ceremony. But there was something in Donna's tone today, that specific flavor of casual dismissal, the kind that doesn't bother to dress itself up or even meet your eyes while it's happening, that made something in Layla's jaw tighten in exactly the way her father had noticed over hot chocolate this morning. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, her voice quiet but clear, no apology in it. "Seat 1A. She held up her phone with the boarding pass displayed. Donna did not look at the screen. She looked at Layla's hoodie again the way a person looks at evidence they have already decided contradicts itself. The priority lane is for full-fare first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members. Donna said each word carrying the patient weight of an explanation given to someone who should already know this. If you upgraded using miles, that's perfectly fine, but upgraded passengers board with their original ticketing class. You'll want to step aside so you're not blocking the customers who have priority access. Customers who have priority access. The framing was precise in its imprecision. Not other customers, not other passengers, but customers with priority access, as though Layla's presence in the lane was itself a kind of presumption that needed to be gently corrected. "I didn't use miles," Layla said, stepping forward. "I purchased a full-fare first-class ticket. I'd appreciate it if you would scan it." Donna's expression moved through several stages, mild irritation at being contradicted, the brief recalculation of someone deciding whether to escalate or simply comply, and then a settling into something harder. "When I finish with the actual priority passengers currently in the lane," she said, and Layla noted the word actual the second time a version of it had appeared in this conversation, "I will address your situation. In the meantime, please step aside." Layla placed her phone directly on the scanner. The machine did not share Donna's assessment of the situation. Green light, confirmation tone. Okafor, Layla. Seat 1A. Welcome aboard. The automated voice was cheerful in the way automated systems are cheerful, indifferent to the drama around it, simply reporting facts. The fact it was reporting was that Layla had a first-class ticket, had always had a first-class ticket, and had had it for 3 months. Donna's face went through its own sequence. Surprise first, then the particular flush of embarrassment that comes from being publicly wrong about something you were confident about, and this was the one that Layla recognized, the one she had seen before, a settling into resentment, as though the machine's confirmation was an affront rather than a correction. She picked up Layla's passport and flipped through it with the deliberate efficiency of someone looking for a discrepancy they were determined to find. The pages showed what they showed: a legitimate American passport, multiple entry stamps, a young woman who had traveled before and would travel again. There was nothing in it that supported the story Donna had already decided to tell. She set the passport on the counter with a sound that was slightly too sharp to be purely accidental. "Go ahead," she said, without looking up, already turning back to her screen. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the dismissal as clean and final as the one she had offered at the start, only this time the direction of travel had reversed. Layla picked up her passport with hands that were steadier than her heartbeat and walked down the jet bridge alone, the sound of her footsteps on the metal floor echoing back at her in the empty space. Actual customers, actual priority. The words walked with her. She had won the exchange. She always won the exchange. And it never not once stopped feeling like losing something. The first-class cabin of Flight 882 was exactly what first-class cabins always were: a deliberate performance of comfort and exclusivity designed to make the people inside it feel that the premium they had paid was reflected in the quality of what they received, from the muted amber lighting, to the cream leather of the recliner seats, to the faint, expensive smell of the air itself, which was somehow different from the air in economy, in a way that was difficult to articulate, but immediately perceptible. Layla found Seat 1A and settled into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this journey before, stowing her messenger bag beneath the seat in front, keeping her tablet on her lap, scanning the cabin with the quick automatic assessment she had learned to make in any new environment. Window seat, front row, enough space to spread out her reading material. 8 hours of uninterrupted work time if she was lucky, which was all she had ever wanted from this seat. She was not in most respects a person who required luxury. She had argued with her father about the first-class ticket because she genuinely believed the money could be used for something better, and she maintained that position, even though she also privately acknowledged that the specific combination of the extra space and the guaranteed window seat and the not sitting next to strangers for 8 hours did materially improve her ability to work on long flights, which was the only thing she was doing this for anyway. She was not here for the champagne. She was here because she had 3 textbooks to get through before Oxford orientation. The flight attendant was working the galley at the front of the cabin when Layla boarded her back, turned arranging something on a service tray with the precise movements of someone who had performed this task so many times that it had become entirely automatic. When she turned around, Layla had a second to see her face before the face registered Layla's presence, and in that second the face was doing what faces do when they are in the middle of a practiced routine. Open professional. The automatic warmth of someone whose job involves making people feel welcome. Then Bryn Calloway's eyes landed on Layla. The warmth did not disappear dramatically. It simply ceased. The way a light doesn't always flicker off, but sometimes just goes, leaving the room in a new state that is its own kind of statement. What replaced it was not hostility. Not initially, it was a specific blankness that Layla recognized as assessment the moment before a person with a fixed idea about how the world is organized encounters something that doesn't fit the organization and has to decide what to do about it. Layla had approximately 2 seconds to register this before Bryn's attention shifted to the man in seat 2, a Mr. Patterson, late 60s, silver hair, expensive briefcase, the specific ease of movement of someone who has occupied first-class cabins so many times that the space has arranged itself around his habits, and the warmth came back as if it had never left fuller, now almost performative in its completeness. "Mr. Patterson, let me take that for you," Bryn said, moving forward with the smooth choreography of first-class service. "Can I start you with champagne, or would you prefer sparkling water this evening?" Layla put her earbuds in. She had clocked the pattern before the plane finished boarding. It was not a subtle pattern. The differential was present in body language, in the angle of Bryn's approach, in the weight her voice put on different words for different people. A kind of gravitational warmth for the older white businessman in 2, a brisk professionalism that was technically correct, but contained no warmth whatsoever for the South Asian man in 3B, who asked where to stow an oversized bag, and an actual pointed redirection, turning away mid-sentence to find a male flight attendant elsewhere in the cabin when the older black woman in 2B needed help reaching the overhead compartment. None of this was surprising. It was simply in Layla's experience of moving through the world, the pattern she had been documenting in her mental case file since she was old enough to understand that it was a pattern and not random rudeness. The pattern she was too tired to address today on a morning that had already included one version of it at the gate because she had 3 textbooks to read, and she did not have the emotional energy left to be anyone's teaching moment. She pulled up her Oxford reading list on her tablet and began. Seat 1B, the aisle seat beside her, was empty when the cabin filled. She allowed herself a small private relief at that 8 hours of reading without the particular social negotiation of a seatmate was a gift she had not expected. She almost didn't notice the man in the seat across the aisle. He was in 1C, and he was reading a physical newspaper which was already unusual enough to register actual newsprint folded in thirds. The way people used to fold newspapers on commuter trains, creased precisely held at the exact right angle for comfortable reading. He was wearing a navy suit with the particular quality of fit that suggested it had been made specifically for his body, rather than adjusted to it afterward, and he was somewhere in his early 60s, with a face that was entirely unremarkable until you noticed what his eyes were doing. They were moving too deliberately to be only reading. In the 17 minutes between Layla's boarding and the moment Victoria Ashworth swept into the cabin and changed everything, the man in 1C glanced up from his newspaper exactly 5 times. Each time his eyes moved with the specific measured attention of someone who is not reacting to what they see but cataloging it the way Layla had seen experienced attorneys look at witnesses, the way she had trained herself to look at documents, looking not for what the thing said but for what the thing meant. He had looked at Bryn's interaction with the South Asian man in 3B. He had looked at the moment Bryn redirected the older black woman to another flight attendant rather than help her herself. And he had looked at Layla just once briefly, with the specific quality of recognition that passes between people who understand what is being demonstrated in front of them. Then he had gone back to his newspaper, and the fold of the paper had shifted just slightly, and he had not looked up again. Not yet. The disruption arrived like a weather event, a rapid barometric drop in the cabin pressure of the social atmosphere, the specific kind of arrival that announces itself before the person has fully cleared the door. "This is completely unacceptable," the voice said. And it was the kind of voice that had spent decades being the loudest one in whatever room it entered, not through volume alone, but through the particular quality of absolute conviction that some people carry, like a physical characteristic. The certainty that what they want and what should happen are the same thing, and always have been. I specifically requested the window seat. Specifically. I have sciatica. Do you understand what sciatica feels like for 8 hours in a standard seat? Victoria Ashworth was wearing a fur coat in July. It was synthetic. Layla clocked that immediately, not because it mattered, but because details mattered, and it caught the cabin lighting in a way that made it seem slightly iridescent, slightly unreal, like something from a production that had run slightly over budget on costumes. Her hair was platinum blonde, constructed into a shape that the July humidity had not touched, which suggested either significant product application or the kind of will that applied to personal grooming as to everything else. Gold jewelry on both wrists, stacked rings on 3 fingers, a Louis Vuitton bag carried in the crook of her arm like a piece of evidence. Her face was the face of a woman in her late 50s who had been beautiful and knew it, and had spent considerable resources ensuring that the evidence of that beauty persisted, and who now wore an expression of such compressed outrage that her features had rearranged themselves into something that was less a face and more a position statement. Bryn Calloway's transformation was instant, if her approach to Mr. Patterson in 2A had been warm. What happened to Bryn's entire body when Victoria Ashworth appeared in the cabin doorway was something categorically different. A kind of full-system deference that went beyond professional courtesy into something approaching reverence. Hands clasped, voice pitched lower and softer, chin angled in a way that was almost a bow without being one. "Mrs. Ashworth. I am so terribly sorry. There must have been a mistake at the gate. Please, let me look at this immediately and find you something I don't want." "Something," Victoria said, sweeping into the cabin with the confidence of a person who has never needed to check whether there was room for her before entering a space. "I want the seat I was promised. I have been flying with Horizon Air for 22 years. 22 years of Diamond membership. And this is how I find myself standing in the aisle before an 8-hour transatlantic flight because someone didn't do their job properly." Her eyes were moving through the cabin as she spoke, conducting the survey of the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who was accustomed to identifying what she wanted and then identifying what stood between her and it. They moved along the row numbers across the occupied seats and then stopped. Seat 1A, the window seat, the girl in the hoodie. The calculation happened visibly. Layla could see it, could track the precise sequence of it across Victoria's face, the way the woman's eyes moved from the seat to Layla's clothing to the seat again, the slight lift of the chin that meant a decision had been made. There, Victoria said. That window seat. I'll take that one. Layla's stomach dropped with a speed and completeness that was almost physical. The specific sensation of a person who has already been through one version of this today and can see the next one forming in front of them with the inevitability of a weather system that has already been set in motion. She did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on her tablet and her hands flat on her lap, and she breathed, which was the only thing she could control right now. Bryn's face lit with the specific illumination of someone who has just been handed a solution to two problems at once. The problem of making Victoria Ashworth happy, which Bryn clearly understood to be non-negotiable, and the problem of the girl in the hoodie who had been sitting in the front window seat since boarding with a quiet self-possession that Bryn had found from the first moment she clocked her, faintly and inexplicably irritating. Here was the perfect resolution. Mrs. Ashworth gets her window seat, the hoodie problem gets relocated. Everyone in first class resumes their journey, and the cabin returns to the order that Bryn's 12 years of service had taught her to maintain. She walked down the aisle with purpose. Her heels clicked against the cabin floor in a rhythm that Layla recognized without turning around as the specific cadence of an approach that has already made up its mind. The tap on her shoulder was harder than it needed to be. Layla removed one earbud and looked up. "We have a situation," Bryn said, and her voice had the professional surface of customer service language stretched over something that was entirely not customer service, the way certain words are used to do a job that other words would be honest about. "Mrs. Ashworth is one of our most valued customers. She has a medical condition that requires her to have a window seat for this flight. I need you to gather your things and move to another seat." "I booked this seat 3 months ago," Layla said, and her voice was level in the way that voices are level when a person is working very hard to keep them that way. "I paid the full fare for this specific seat. I'm not moving." Victoria Ashworth made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an expression of disbelief, the kind of sound a person makes when they encounter resistance they had not budgeted for. Bryn's professional surface thinned. "I understand you booked the seat, but this is about compassion for a passenger in genuine medical discomfort. You are young and perfectly healthy. Mrs. Ashworth is in pain. Surely you can appreciate I paid $5,400 for this seat," Layla said, and she was still not raising her voice, which was itself a kind of discipline, the kind that her mother had demonstrated in hospital corridors when people handed her parking validation forms instead of patient charts, the kind that cost something every single time. "I'm not moving because someone wants it." The cabin was quiet now in the way that spaces go quiet when the thing that is happening is the only thing worth attending to. Mr. Patterson in 2A had lowered his Wall Street Journal slowly with the careful movements of a man who does not want to be noticed noticing. The couple across the aisle had stopped their conversation mid-sentence, and in seat 1C, the man with the navy suit and the physical newspaper had set the newspaper down entirely on his lap, with his hands folded on top of it, and he was watching the exchange with the focused attention of someone who has decided that this is important. "Look at her," Victoria announced to the cabin, to Bryn, to the air itself, with the particular confidence of a woman who is accustomed to the world agreeing with her assessments. "Look at how she's dressed. This is a first-class cabin. There are standards." Bryn looked at Victoria. Then she looked at Layla. Something passed across her face, the brief shadow of a person who knows somewhere below the level of what they are willing to acknowledge that what they are about to do cannot be defended on its stated grounds. Then the shadow passed and the decision settled in. "I'm going to need you to move," she said, and this time it was not a request. Bryn Calloway had 12 years of first-class service and a union contract, and a very specific understanding of what the words federal offense could do to a person's decision-making when deployed at the right moment. And she used all 3 of them in the next 4 minutes, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had at some point in those 12 years learned that escalation was a tool that could be wielded like any other. The FAA regulations came first. Refusing a direct instruction from a flight crew member constitutes interference with a flight operation, which is a federal offense under Title 49 of the United States Code, delivered in the smooth, slightly too fast cadence of something that had been said before that was designed to produce a specific effect, which was the effect of the word federal settling into a person's chest cavity and doing its work there. Then the criminal record. This could follow you for the rest of your life. It could affect your applications to universities, to law programs, to every professional opportunity you are planning to pursue. And here, Bryn's eyes moved over Layla with the deliberate inventory of someone estimating what those future opportunities might look like for a person dressed the way this person was dressed, which was its own kind of insult layered inside the threat. Then finally the physical removal. If you do not comply with this instruction, I will call security and have you escorted off this aircraft delivered with Victoria Ashworth's vocal support from the aisle where she was standing with her arms crossed and her chin elevated, and the satisfied expression of a woman watching an argument she expected to win resolve itself in the expected direction. Layla was still sitting perfectly upright in seat 1, her hands flat on her lap. Her breathing controlled in the way that breathing is controlled when a person is managing something that wants to come out differently. She had counted in the past 7 minutes the number of times Bryn had used the word actually or actual in reference to passengers who were not Layla 4 times, and the number of times Victoria had used the word look while gesturing toward her 3 times, and she had found in the counting a useful distance from the part of her that wanted to say the thing that would feel best and the part of her that understood that saying it would cost more than she could afford. "I have not raised my voice," Layla said with the precision of someone reading from a document they have prepared. "I have not threatened anyone. I have not disrupted the boarding process. I sat down in the seat I paid for 3 months ago, and I have been reading. That is the entirety of what I have done." "You are being," Bryn said. And the pause before the next word was the pause of a person selecting from available options. "Belligerent." The man in seat 1C had at some point in the last 2 minutes taken a small leather notebook from his inside jacket pocket. He was writing in it with a pen that he held in his left hand, and he was writing without looking at the notebook, his eyes still on the scene unfolding 6 feet away from him, which meant that what he was writing were notes, specific, detailed, the kind that a person takes, not because they think they will forget, but because they understand that the value of documentation is in its contemporaneity. Layla noticed the notebook. She registered it without reacting to it, filed it away. Victoria stepped closer to Bryn's position in the aisle, which had the effect of turning the encounter into something that felt more like a confrontation than a customer service interaction, the geometry of 2 people on one side and 1 person on the other doing its work in the space. "Tiffany, are you going to let this child?" she began. "Bryn," Bryn said tightly. "Bryn," Victoria corrected without apology. "Are you going to let this child speak to us this way while I am standing here in genuine physical distress? This is absolutely not the service I have paid for." Bryn pulled a phone from her uniform pocket and pressed a number with the focused decisiveness of someone enacting a plan that had already been decided. "This is Flight Attendant Calloway on Flight 882, she said, her voice shifting back into its official register, the one that added several degrees of authority by removing all warmth. "I have an uncooperative passenger in first class refusing crew instructions. I need a supervisor and security at gate 31 immediately." Layla felt her hand move to her hoodie pocket to the backup phone, and she stopped it. She had promised herself. She had made the specific private commitment over years of being in smaller versions of this moment that she would not be the girl who called in the rescue, that she would handle what she encountered with her own words and her own standing and her own refusal to be moved, and that her father's name and her father's company were hers to protect by not deploying them as weapons every time the world required her to prove her right to take up space. She tried once more, She turned to Bryn and she said very clearly the thing that was simply true. "There is no legal basis for this instruction. You are asking me to surrender a seat. I have a confirmed reservation and a paid receipt for no reason that has anything to do with safety or legitimate crew authority. This is discrimination. I would like you to acknowledge that." Bryn stepped closer to her in the aisle, close enough that Layla could smell the specific floral heaviness of her perfume, and she lowered her voice to just above a whisper, which was not softer but more intimate, more precisely aimed. "Somewhere," she said, "that you'll fit in better." "That's all I'm trying to find you. Somewhere more appropriate for someone like you." The words sat in the air of the cabin and did not leave. The man in 1C was still writing. Darnell Webb arrived at Gate 31 4 minutes after Bryn's call, and he had been told by the gate supervisor who had been told by Bryn that there was an uncooperative passenger in first class refusing crew instructions. And that was the entirety of his briefing, which meant that he arrived with his mind already organized around the specific task of removing an uncooperative passenger, rather than around the prior question of whether the passenger's refusal was in fact uncooperative or whether it was alternatively the correct response to an instruction that had no legitimate basis. He was a large man. Layla had registered this when he first appeared at the cabin door, the way a person registers information that is relevant to their physical safety, well over 200 pounds, uniformed, with the practiced authority of someone whose professional identity was organized around the application of institutional weight to situations that required resolution. He did not ask Layla's name. He did not review the seating manifest. He did not ask Bryn to explain in his presence the specific grounds on which she was requiring this passenger to move. He looked at the situation Bryn standing in the aisle. Victoria Ashworth behind her, a teenage girl in a hoodie sitting in seat 1. Looking up at him with an expression that contained no panic but a great deal of understanding, and he had enough information from his perspective to proceed. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had the specifically impersonal quality of authority that has decided to be polite only as a procedural step before the next step. "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me. My boarding pass shows I have a confirmed reservation for this seat," Layla said, and she was looking at him with the steady directness of someone who is choosing very deliberately not to be afraid of the thing in front of them. "I paid full fare. I have documentation. I have done nothing that justifies removal." "Captain's authority," Darnell said, and this was what he had been told to say, and so he said it. "You're causing a disruption. Time to go." She made the call then, not because she had run out of options. She could have argued further. She could have demanded the captain's direct involvement. She could have pulled up the FAA passenger rights provisions on her phone and read them aloud. But because she looked at Darnell's face and she understood that he had already resolved the situation in his mind, and that the remaining steps were procedural, and she understood that when a large man who has decided to remove you starts moving the phone is the thing you reach for first. She had one contact open. "Dad. Emergency." She pressed it. It rang once. Darnell's hand closed around her upper arm. The phone went to the floor. Afterwards, Layla would think about the sequence of the next 10 seconds with the specific precision of a person who has trained themselves to observe and remember accurately under pressure, and what she would remember was this. The grip was not the grip of a man who was trying to hurt her, but it was also not the grip of a man who was thinking about whether she might be hurt, which in her experience of the world was frequently more dangerous than deliberate cruelty because it was invisible to the person doing it. It pressed into the tissue of her upper arm in 4 distinct places. She could feel the separate fingers with enough force that she cried out the sound coming out before she had decided to make it, which was how she knew it was real pain rather than performed pain. The phone hit the carpet and skidded forward. Bryn Calloway's foot was there, and the movement she made was small and precise. Barely a nudge, the kind of thing that could almost be described as accidental by someone who wanted to describe it that way, and the phone disappeared under the seat. "We'll have it mailed to you," Bryn said. Victoria Ashworth clapped. The walk down the aisle was the longest walk Layla had taken in recent memory, and it was long, not because of its physical length, but because of what it contained, every face in the first-class cabin turning toward her. Every passenger watching the whispers she could hear, even through the blood rushing in her ears. Making such a scene should have just moved. Probably didn't even pay for it. And underneath them, the more painful silence of people who were watching something wrong happen and had made a calculation about the cost of saying so and decided the cost was too high. She did not look at any of them. She looked at the man in 1C as she passed his row, and he was watching her go, and his pen was moving, and his face held the expression of a person who has seen enough and has already decided what to do about it, which was the expression she realized later of someone who had jurisdiction. The jet bridge hit her with a wall of July heat after the aggressive cold of the cabin, and behind her, the aircraft door began its hydraulic swing toward, closed, and through the terminal windows. The tarmac below Gate 31 was beginning to fill with things that had no business being there. Blue lights, black vehicles moving with the precision of something that had been aimed rather than directed, and in the sky, coming in at the wrong angle entirely. For anything that was following standard approach patterns, a black jet with a gold letter on its tail was descending, like something that had been dropped from a very specific height toward a very specific point. Darnell Webb's hand loosened on her arm. He was staring through the window. Layla wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand and looked at the jet. She knew that tail number. She had grown up with that tail number. It had been on the side of a plane that had flown her to her mother's funeral and to her first international competition, and to the moment 2 years ago when her father sat across from her in that cabin and listened to her explain why she wanted to go to law school and said nothing for a very long time, and then said of course simply and completely the way Nathaniel Okafor said all things. He meant absolutely. She looked at Darnell Webb. "That's my father's jet," she said quietly, not as a threat, and not as a triumph, but as simple information that she felt he was owed. And I think he's not very happy right now. Sarah Briggs had been an air traffic controller at JFK for 11 years, and she had seen a great many things from the elevated glass of the tower that had required her to make rapid assessments of situations with incomplete information and imperfect options. But she had not seen anything quite like the blip that appeared on her radar at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in July and began doing things that blips were not supposed to do. The aircraft was a Gulfstream G800 registration November 4 Kilo, and it was not following its filed approach pattern. It was, in fact, doing something that could most accurately be described as coming in with intent, cutting through the commercial traffic corridors at an angle and a speed that suggested whoever was piloting it had decided that the normal rules of airspace coordination were a conversation they were willing to have after the fact rather than before. November 4th. "Kilo, you are not cleared for that approach," Sarah said into her headset, maintaining the professional calm that her training had built into her voice for precisely these situations. "Abort immediately, circle tower, await instructions." November 4th. "Kilo, we have emergency authorization from Homeland Security." The pilot's voice was calm in the way that voices are calm when they are reading from a script that has already been approved at a level well above the conversation they are currently having. "Check your supervisor's desk. Documentation was transmitted 90 seconds ago." Sarah spun in her chair. Her supervisor, Marcus Webb, no relation to the gate agent who currently had his hand around a teenager's arm on a jet bridge 2,000 feet away, was staring at his computer screen with his mouth slightly open, which was not an expression she associated with Marcus Webb, who was not a man given to displays of being surprised. "It's legitimate," he said without her asking. "Authorization came directly from DHS, Deputy Director's Office." He looked up from the screen. "This aircraft has priority clearance above all commercial traffic currently in our airspace." "That's not possible," Sarah said. "Who has that level of authorization?" Marcus turned his screen toward her so she could read the name on the authorization document, and she read it, and she understood why his mouth had been open. Nathaniel Okafor, CEO, Okafor Energy Group. Sarah's hand went to her headset and came back down again. She knew that name. Everyone in East Coast aviation knew that name in the specific way that people know the names of things that the functioning of their entire industry depends on the way pilots know the name of the manufacturer of their aircraft. The way air traffic controllers know the names of the regulatory bodies whose rules govern their every working moment. Okafor Energy Group was not a company in the normal sense of a company. It was in practical terms the reason that the majority of aircraft at this airport had the fuel in their tanks that allowed them to do what aircraft were supposed to do. She said very quietly to no one in particular. What happened? On the tarmac below the Gulfstream's wheels made contact with concrete with a sound that the tower could hear even from this height. A controlled, deliberate screech that was the auditory equivalent of a declaration, and the aircraft did not slow to taxiing speed, but instead turned with the purposeful geometry of something that knew exactly where it was going, crossing the safety zone in a direct line toward Gate 31 toward the nose gear of a Horizon Air commercial aircraft that was currently sitting at the gate with its door sealed and an argument in its recent past that was about to become a great deal more consequential than any of its participants had understood. Darnell Webb's hand dropped from Layla's arm. He was staring through the terminal window at the private jet, now parked perpendicular to Flight 882's path, 90 degrees perfectly positioned, so that if the commercial aircraft tried to push back even 6 feet, it would make contact with the Gulfstream's wing, and then at the 3 black SUVs that had arrived on the tarmac from somewhere outside the normal flow of ground traffic, moving with the coordinated precision of vehicles that had practiced this exact approach, their emergency lights cutting through the afternoon brightness in the specific blue-white pattern that meant federal authority rather than airport security. Darnell started. "I tried to tell you," Layla said, still quiet, rubbing the circulation back into her upper arm. "That call you interrupted, that was to my father." She paused, and it was not a dramatic pause, but a tired one. The pause of a person who is exhausted by having to explain the thing they should not have to explain. "His name is Nathaniel Okafor. He runs the company that supplies aviation fuel to most of the airports in this region, including this one." Darnell's face went through a sequence of expressions that she watched without particular satisfaction. The initial dismissal, the recalculation, the beginning of understanding, and then the specific pale that comes when understanding is complete, and its implications are fully landed. "Oh, God," he said. "You grabbed my arm without asking me a single question," Layla said, not accusing, simply noting the fact, because facts were what she dealt in and this was a relevant fact. "You didn't verify my ticket. You didn't ask Bryn for the grounds. You just assumed they were telling you the truth and I was the problem." He had no answer for that because there was no answer for that. Below the Gulfstream's door opened. The head of security who stepped out first was a man named Victor Adeyemi, and he was the kind of man whose presence in a space changed the space not through size, though he was considerable, but through the specific quality of calm that comes from having operated in environments where the absence of calm had very real and immediate consequences. He had spent 18 years in federal law enforcement before Nathaniel Okafor hired him, and he moved now across the tarmac with the unhurried assessment of someone for whom this situation registered on his personal scale of difficult situations he had been required to manage as somewhere in the middle range. He produced credentials for the Port Authority officers who had arrived at the base of the jet bridge stairs with hands near their holsters and expressions that mixed professional training with genuine uncertainty about what exactly they were dealing with. The credentials were real. The officers could see that immediately, and the level they represented was several steps above the level these officers were accustomed to dealing with in the course of a regular afternoon at JFK Diplomatic Security Service, Victor said in the voice of a man for whom this was a statement rather than an explanation. We have emergency authorization for extraction of a high-value individual. The passenger in question was physically assaulted on that aircraft. We're here for her. The officers lowered their hands. Inside the cockpit of Flight 882, Captain David Osei had been staring at his windscreen for the past 3 minutes with the focused attention of a pilot who has identified a situation that his 21 years of commercial aviation have not specifically prepared him for. The Gulfstream was parked with mathematical precision across his taxi path, close enough that the geometry of departure had become a geometry of impossibility, and there were federal vehicles on his tarmac and armed personnel whose credentials his tower was apparently validating, and his first officer was doing the thing where she looked at him sideways without turning her head, which was the thing she did when she understood that this was not a weather delay or a mechanical issue, but something categorically outside the procedural framework they had both trained for. He pressed the intercom. "Bryn, I need you in the cockpit, now." Bryn Calloway arrived at the cockpit door with the particular composure of someone who had managed a difficult passenger situation and considered it resolved, which was the composure of a person who did not yet know that the situation had extended several thousand feet beyond the aircraft door. Captain Osei opened the door and pointed without preamble at the windscreen. "Do you see that aircraft?" Bryn looked at the Gulfstream. "Do you see the registration on the tail?" She squinted at the letters and numbers. "N4-OKF, Captain Osei said. "I need you to tell me the full name of the passenger you had removed from this aircraft." Bryn blinked. She gave her name as Okafor. She was being disruptive and refusing." "Layla Okafor," Captain Osei said. He said it with the flatness of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping not to confirm. "Daughter of Nathaniel Okafor, CEO of Okafor Energy Group." The silence that followed was of a quality that Bryn would remember. "He supplies fuel to this airport." Captain Osei continued still in the same flat register, to 68% of the commercial airports on the eastern seaboard, and he has just landed his private aircraft in our taxi path and is currently parked in a position that prevents us from moving 6 inches in any direction. He paused. "So I am going to ask you one more time, and I need you to think carefully before you answer what exactly did you do to his daughter." Bryn's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. On the tarmac below Nathaniel Okafor descended the stairs of the Gulfstream. He was 54 years old, wearing a charcoal suit of the kind that is entirely unremarkable until you look at the way it moves. And he descended the stairs with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had already decided everything that was going to happen and was now simply allowing the sequence of events to proceed at its natural speed. He was not rushing because rushing was not necessary. He had the specific patience of someone for whom the outcome is not in question. At the bottom of the stairs, Victor Adeyemi met him and said something brief and quiet. Nathaniel listened with his chin slightly down the way he listened to all information he was processing seriously, and then he nodded once with his jaw set in a way that was not anger. Anger was a thing that made people louder. And Nathaniel Okafor had gone very quiet, and he looked up at the jet bridge. He found her. She was standing at the top of the stairs, still in her hoodie. Her bag gone somewhere in the chaos, rubbing her right hand over her left upper arm with the unconscious repetition of someone who is managing pain they haven't fully processed yet. And she was looking down at him with an expression that he recognized had been watching her manage in smaller moments for 19 years, which was the expression of a person who has held something together for as long as they needed to hold it, and now did not need to anymore. For 1 second, 2 seconds, the CEO mask that Layla Okafor wore so continuously that most people who knew him professionally would have been surprised to learn it was a mask at all. It simply dropped. What was underneath it was a father who had let his daughter fly alone to protect the version of herself she was trying to build, who had respected the choice she'd made to go unannounced into the world, and who had been sitting in a board meeting in Midtown Manhattan when his phone rang and he had heard his child's voice say, "Dad, emergency," and then heard the call cut off. Then the mask came back, harder than before. Arnold Briggs, the station manager for Horizon Air at JFK, arrived across the tarmac at a pace that was physically almost a run but maintained the last shred of professional dignity by not quite crossing into one, his tie displaced over one shoulder, his face carrying the particular expression of a man whose entire professional day has just been reorganized around a crisis that has his name on it and that he does not yet fully understand. Mr. Okafor Arnold said, slightly breathless, "I want to assure you that we are treating this situation with the highest." 30 seconds. Nathaniel said, still walking, not looking at Arnold. "Every person who put their hands on my daughter, every person who spoke to her with deliberate disrespect, I want them standing in front of me in 30 seconds or I begin the process of terminating every fuel contract this airline has with Okafor Energy Group effective immediately." Arnold opened his mouth. "Read Section 14, Paragraph 3 of our service agreement," Nathaniel said. "Safety concerns give me unilateral termination rights. I have a daughter with bruises forming on her arm from an altercation that began with your staff deciding she didn't belong in a seat she paid for." He stopped walking and turned to look at Arnold with the full weight of his attention, which was the kind of attention that made people understand why he had built what he had built. 20 seconds, Arnold." Arnold Briggs ran for the jet bridge stairs. The passengers in the first-class cabin of Flight 882 had been watching the scene on the tarmac for the past 6 minutes through the oval windows with the concentrated attention of people who had paid for a transatlantic flight and were receiving instead a live event of a different kind entirely. And the reactions varied in the way that reactions to witnessed injustice always vary from the couple in 3A and 3B, who were leaning forward and whispering to each other with the urgent, slightly horrified energy of people who understood that they had seen something terrible and were only now confronting the extent of their failure to say anything about it to Mr. Patterson in 2A, who had set his newspaper on the seat beside him and was sitting very still with a particular expression that was the expression of a man who has spent a lifetime occupying the kinds of spaces that are never questioned, and is experiencing for possibly the first time the specific discomfort of understanding what that has meant for everyone who has not had that luxury. Victoria Ashworth was still in seat 1A. She had accepted a second glass of champagne, partly from force of habit, and partly from the instinct of a woman who has always found that maintaining the performance of comfort is the most effective response to the early signs of a situation going wrong. And she was in the middle of a comment to the flight attendant David about the quality of the cabin temperature when Arnold Briggs burst through the aircraft door. He looked like a man who had been struck by something very fast and very unexpected. His shirt was translucent with sweat at the collar, and his face had passed through several colors in the past 3 minutes and was currently residing in a shade of gray-pink that was not healthy. He was breathing in the rapid, slightly irregular pattern of someone who had run farther and faster than their cardiovascular system had anticipated. "Bryn Calloway," he said to the cabin, to the air, and his voice had the quality of someone who is saying a name the way you say the name of a thing you need to fix immediately. Bryn stepped out of the galley. The look that passed between them was brief and contained a great deal of information, most of it moving in one direction. "Mr. Briggs, I can explain exactly what—" "There is a federal judge on this aircraft," Arnold said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word federal, who has been observing this entire situation since boarding and has provided documentation to our ground legal team in the past 8 minutes. The man in seat 1C looked up from his notebook. Federal Judge Raymond Aldridge of the Southern District of New York was 61 years old, and he had, over the course of 22 years on the bench, developed the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending 2 decades in rooms where the most consequential thing a person could do was to see clearly and record accurately. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not need to be. He had the authority of someone whose position in the room is structural rather than performed, and what he did now was simply close his notebook look at Arnold Briggs with the even attention of someone who had been watching and had reached conclusions and hold out a business card. Arnold took it. He read it. He looked up. "I have been on this aircraft since boarding," Judge Aldridge said in the measured, precise cadence of a man who chooses his words because they will be important later. "I observed the entirety of the interactions between your flight attendant and the passenger in seat 1A. I have contemporaneous notes. I have submitted a statement to your legal team and to the Port Authority officers on your tarmac, and I will be available to testify regarding what I observed." He paused. "I would encourage your company to proceed accordingly." The silence in the first-class cabin was the silence of people who have been watching something unfold that they understood on some level was wrong, and who are now confronting the specific moment when wrong becomes documented, and documented becomes consequential. Victoria Ashworth set her champagne glass down on the tray table. Arnold turned to Bryn and said with the compressed fury of a man who is too professional to shout and too scared not to communicate the gravity of what is happening, "Jet Bridge. Now." Then he looked at the cabin at large and found seated in 3B the gate agent who had delivered Layla to the jet bridge. Darnell Webb. Jet bridge. Bryn stood very still for a moment. The stillness of a person who has understood that the ground they were standing on has changed completely, and who is trying to locate the new ground. 12 years. 12 years of first-class service of managing the social architecture of premium cabins with the specific skill set that the airline had valued and rewarded and never once questioned. She had filed 3 previous complaints about passengers of color that management had reviewed and closed. She had operated within a culture that had communicated to her through 12 years of approvals and promotions and silent validations that her assessments of who belonged in her cabin were reliable. None of that was going to matter now. She walked toward the jet bridge. Victoria Ashworth, seated in 1A, had been following the sequence of Arnold's arrivals and departures with the growing unease of a woman who has been present at the beginning of something and is watching it develop in a direction she had not anticipated. When Arnold had arrived, flushed and urgent, she had assumed that the urgency was procedural, the managing of a disruption, the restoration of the natural order of things. When Judge Aldridge had produced his card, she had watched Arnold's face change in a way that introduced for the first time the possibility that the order being restored was not the one she had expected. She heard the name Okafor, then from David the junior flight attendant who had been on his phone in the galley and came forward with the specific expression of someone delivering information they wished they did not have. And she heard the words Okafor Energy Group, and she heard the words 68% of East Coast aviation fuel. And she set her champagne glass down very carefully, because her hand had become slightly unreliable, and she sat very still in seat 1A, and waited to understand what she had done. Nathaniel Okafor stood at the base of the jet bridge stairs and waited. And the waiting was its own kind of statement. The stillness of a man who had all the time in the world and every piece of leverage in the situation and did not need to demonstrate either by being loud about them. Bryn Calloway came down the stairs first, gripping the railing with both hands and the specific grip of a person whose legs are not entirely reliable. She had rearranged her expression by the time she reached the bottom, reconstructing the professional composure that was her default presentation, but the composure was the kind that is held together by effort rather than calm, and it showed in the small movements, the tight set of her shoulders, the way her eyes moved too quickly. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable for him. "My daughter asked you," he said eventually, to scan her ticket, not to interview her about her clothing, not to assess whether her appearance was consistent with her reservation, to scan her ticket. Bryn opened her mouth. She asked you. Nathaniel continued in the same even register 7 times by my attorney's count from the passenger statements he has already collected to simply verify her documentation. And 7 times you found a reason to delay, redirect, or dismiss her. A pause. You then physically took her phone from her hand, and when she asked for it back, you kicked it under the seat. I was following Victor, Nathaniel said without raising his voice or taking his eyes off Bryn, and Victor Adeyemi stepped forward from his position 6 feet away. Port Authority Officer Elena Reyes had been standing at a respectful distance during this exchange, and she stepped forward now as well. Her notebook in her hand, her expression professional and precise. She had already photographed Layla's arm at Nathaniel's attorney's request. 4 pressure mark bruises, index finger width, in the specific pattern of a grip. Darnell Webb came down the stairs next, and he came down slowly with the particular bearing of a man who has had several minutes on the jet bridge to understand the full scope of what he has walked into. He was no longer the gate agent who had arrived at the cabin door 40 minutes ago with the authority of an institution behind him. He was a man who had put his hands on a teenager without asking a single question first, and the difference between those 2 things was becoming very concrete in the structure of the afternoon. She showed you her ticket, Nathaniel said to Darnell. She explained her reservation. She was calm. She was not threatening anyone. She was 19 years old and weighed approximately 118 pounds, and you grabbed her hard enough to leave marks that a physician has documented. He looked at Darnell with the direct attention of someone who has already decided and is simply completing the formality of the conversation. You didn't ask one question. Darnell's jaw worked. I was told she was uncooperative. I was following the instruction from you were following an assumption, Nathaniel said, and it was the only time in the entire conversation that something underneath the even tone of his voice briefly showed itself. Not anger. Something older and more specific than anger. The particular exhaustion of a man who has watched his daughter navigate a world that makes these assumptions about her on a continuous basis, and has spent 19 years trying to prepare her for something that should not require preparation. My daughter's assumption is not the same as a security threat, and the first question a professional asks before putting his hands on a young woman is whether the story he's been told is accurate. Officer Reyes stepped forward to Darnell. Mr. Webb, based on the documented injury and passenger witness statements, I'm placing you under arrest for assault and battery. She produced handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Darnell's voice cracked. He said his children's names. He said he had a mortgage. He said he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. Nathaniel watched this without expression. The handcuffs went on. Bryn Calloway was arrested next theft for the phone and facilitating assault, and she stopped trying to hold the composure together at that point because the composure had served its purpose and was no longer doing anything for her. What replaced it was something more honest, which was the specific shock of a person confronting the possibility that the protection they believed they had of uniform, of institutional backing, of 12 years of good performance reviews was not protection at all and had never been. Victoria Ashworth came down the stairs last. Arnold had returned to the aircraft 3 times before she moved. She had in the interim looked out the window at the scene below, at the federal vehicles, at the handcuffed airline employees, at the man in the charcoal suit standing at the base of the stairs with the stillness of something that was very large and very patient. And she had done the specific calculation of a woman who has spent her life trading on social currency and is confronting for the first time a situation in which that currency has no value. She came down the stairs in her fur coat, still carrying the Louis Vuitton bag, her heels clicking against each metal step, and she arrived on the tarmac with an attempt at the posture she had been wearing all day. The posture of a person who belongs everywhere and questions no one. But the attempt had no structural support anymore, and it showed. "I don't know who you think you are," She started with something like her earlier authority, and then Nathaniel turned to look at her, and the sentence stopped. "You called my daughter trash," he said. "Not a question. A document." Victoria's mouth worked. "You were not involved in the seating dispute until you chose to become involved in it." Nathaniel continued. "You chose to use the word trash in front of 50 witnesses, several of whom were recording. You chose to clap." He let that sit. "I made 2 calls on the flight here. One to my head of security, who located your husband's direct number in approximately 4 minutes. One to your husband." The champagne glass had already been left on the tray table upstairs. Victoria had nothing in her hands now and nothing to hold on to. "Richard," she said, and it was barely a sound. "He sends his apologies," Nathaniel said. "His attorney will be in touch with yours." Victoria sat down on the bottom step of the jet bridge, her coat pooling around her on the tarmac, and the particular architecture of her afternoon, the authority, the certainty, the absolute conviction that she was the kind of person who gets what she wants, dismantled around her in the July heat without requiring anyone to dismantle it. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "No charges," he said to Officer Reyes. "She has enough." He looked up at the jet bridge to where Layla was standing and said, "Come here, baby girl." She came down the stairs, and when she reached the bottom, he pulled her into his arms, and she let him, and she put her face against his shoulder, and she finally let the thing she had been holding together all day come apart the way things do when you are finally somewhere safe enough to let them. "I tried not to use your name," she said, muffled in his jacket. "I know," he said. "I tried to handle it myself." "I know. You handled it perfectly." He pulled back gently and pushed up her sleeve and looked at her arm and looked at it for a long time with the expression of a father who is keeping something very controlled that does not want to be controlled. And then he said, "You have nothing to apologize for. Not one thing. Do you hear me?" She nodded. He did not look at Bryn Calloway or Darnell Webb again. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and walked her toward the Gulf Stream, and she walked with him, and the tarmac was bright and hot, and full of the noise of a situation resolving itself, and above them the afternoon sky was the particular deep blue of a summer day that will be remembered for a very long time. The Gulfstream G800 was configured the way Nathaniel Okafor configured all long-distance transport for work primarily and for the specific kind of privacy that allows a person to be themselves rather than a version of themselves, which meant that the interior was quiet and clean and smelled of nothing in particular, which was itself a luxury after the heavy perfume and recycled air of the commercial cabin. Layla sank into the nearest seat and put both hands over her face and sat there for a moment, just breathing, doing the specific internal accounting that a person does after the adrenaline has finished its work and the body is recalculating what it actually costs to hold something together for that long. Dr. Priscilla Nakamura, who had been waiting on the aircraft, came forward immediately with the practiced calm of a physician who has spent decades working in situations where calm is more useful than urgency. She was gentle with Layla's arm, examining the bruising, pressing lightly at the points where the marks were deepest, photographing the injury in the flat, even light of the cabin with the documentation instinct of someone who understood the difference between evidence and a record. 4 distinct pressure marks deep tissue, the index finger width spacing of a large hand, gripping hard and fast. "This is going to get more vivid before it gets better," Dr. Nakamura said, wrapping the arm in a compression bandage with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has said this kind of thing many times. "A week, maybe 10 days before it's fully resolved." "Okay," Layla said. "You did nothing wrong," the doctor added, and it was said simply the way medical professionals sometimes say the thing that is also true, but not strictly clinical, because the clinical and the human are the same patient. "I know," Layla said, "and then because knowing and believing are the same word and different experiences, I'm working on believing it." Nathaniel sat across from her as the doctor returned to her seat at the back of the aircraft, and he had removed his jacket and set it aside, which was the version of him that was her father, rather than the CEO, the slight loosening of the collar, the reading glasses he pushed up on his head even though he didn't need them yet, the specific quality of his attention when it was directed entirely at her. "Talk to me," he said. She looked out the window. The Gulf Stream was not moving yet. The tarmac was still active, still full of the machinery of consequence, and through the oval window she could see Flight 882 sitting at Gate 31, its passengers still visible at the windows, the aircraft going nowhere. "I've been through smaller versions of this my whole life," she said, not looking at him, because some things are easier to say to windows every time I handle it. Every time I walk away. Every time I tell myself it's not worth the energy to make it a thing. A pause. Today, it became a thing. "Today, they put their hands on you," Nathaniel said. "Before that, though, when it was just words, just looks, just Bryn deciding I didn't belong in her cabin before I said a single sentence. That's the version I'm more used to. And I don't know how to explain how it adds up. It's not one incident. It's the accumulation of every incident, and the way each one costs a little something that you can't entirely recover before the next one." Nathaniel was quiet in his listening way. "I thought about moving," she said. "When Victoria first started in with the sciatica and the 22 years of loyalty and all of it, I thought this isn't worth it. Just move, make it simpler, let her have it. And I didn't, because she stopped. Because you paid for that seat," Nathaniel said. "Because of what it would mean to move," she said. "Because there's no version of moving that isn't agreeing with them, that isn't saying, yes, you're right, I don't actually belong here." She turned from the window and looked at him. "Mom would have made more noise than I did," she said. Nathaniel's expression shifted, the specific softening that happened whenever a daze was invoked, which was not weakness, but the opposite of it. The particular strength of a person who loves someone they've lost and has found a way to carry that love without being crushed by its weight. "Your mother," he said, "would have called the NAACP and called 3 journalists before we hit the jet bridge." The corner of his mouth moved. "You showed significantly more restraint. Is that good? It's different. Your mother burned things down. You build cases." He reached across and held her hand, his thumb moving once across her knuckles. "Both matter. Both work. You just work differently. Harrison Okafor Mensa, no relation." The coincidence of a shared name that had been a running joke between him and Nathaniel for 15 years called from New York while the Gulf Stream was still on the tarmac, and he spoke quickly with the efficiency of a man who had been working for the past 40 minutes and had things to report. Criminal charges accepted. Civil suit, drafted assault battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Civil rights violations, negligent supervision. Horizon Air's stock price was down 16%. 11 passengers had already sent video footage and offered statements. The airline's CEO had called twice. When Harrison said the number being discussed for Layla's individual damages, she looked at her father with an expression that was both startled and conflicted. "That goes into a fund," she said immediately. "All of it. For people who've been through this and can't afford to fight it." Harrison paused on the line. "Then, that's your decision to make. It's made," Layla said. The Gulfstream's engines began to warm. Through the window, the tarmac was beginning to clear the federal vehicles withdrawing the Port Authority. Completing their procedures, the commercial aircraft still sitting at the gate with its nose gear pointed toward the gap where the Gulfstream had been parked. It would be moving soon. Its passengers would complete their flight to London. Layla watched it for a moment. "What would you have done?" she asked her father if I hadn't called Nathaniel. Considered this seriously, the way he considered all serious questions. "I would have found out eventually," he said. "These things tend to find their way out." A pause. But I'm glad you called. I promised myself I wouldn't use your name. I know. I broke the promise. You called for help when someone was hurting you, Nathaniel said. That's not breaking a promise. That's knowing when the principle ends and the emergency begins. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. Those are two different things, Layla. It's important to know the difference. She leaned back in the seat and let the compression bandage on her arm do its quiet work and watched London coming toward them through the front windscreen of a jet that had landed in the middle of an afternoon at JFK and changed the direction of several lives, including the one she was still in the process of building. The Gulf Stream leveled off at 42,000 feet above the commercial corridors above the weather systems, working their way across the Atlantic and Layla's phone. The backup phone retrieved by Dr. Nakamura from the jet bridge before departure, along with Layla's messenger bag, which had been collected by Victor Adeyemi, began doing the thing that phones do when a story has escaped the private sphere and entered the public one. The notifications came in the specific pattern of something going viral, the first few arriving individually, then clustering, then arriving in a continuous stream that made the phone feel like it was vibrating with a kind of biological urgency. 11 separate videos from 11 separate passengers. The compilation already on YouTube. The hashtag Layla didn't look at it, but Nathaniel's communications director called from New York with the number 43 million views in 2 hours and climbing. Horizon's stock, the director said, is down 18%. Layla opened the Twitter app with the specific intention of a person who knows they should not do this and is doing it anyway, because the alternative is not knowing, and not knowing has its own weight. The comments were a war zone of exactly the kind she'd anticipated: people who understood what they had watched, and people who had decided what they had watched before they watched it, and people whose responses to both were what those responses were. She scrolled past the cruelty. She scrolled past the support. She found near the middle of the trending thread a single post from an account with 17 followers, a woman in Ohio named Delia who had written, "My daughter is 12, and she watched this video and she asked me why those people thought that girl didn't belong there. I didn't have a good answer. I hope someone does something about it." Layla read it twice and then set the phone face down on the seat beside her and looked out the window at the Atlantic below, which was very large and very dark, and entirely indifferent to the events of the afternoon. "I didn't want to be famous," she said. "I know her father said. I wanted to go to Oxford and read for 8 hours and sleep for 2 and arrive without anyone knowing who I was. I know." She was quiet for a moment, watching the clouds. "That woman in Ohio. Her daughter is 12. She asked why they thought I didn't belong there." Nathaniel waited. "What do we say to the 12-year-olds?" Layla asked. Not the legal answer, not the policy answer. What do we actually say? Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "I think you're about to figure that out," he said. London Heathrow's private terminal was its own particular economy of discretion designed for arrivals that do not need to pass through the machinery of public travel, and on an ordinary day, Layla would have appreciated the directness of it, the clean line from aircraft door to waiting car. Today, the news vans were at the perimeter fence with telephoto lenses, because the story had moved faster than the aircraft, and several 100,000 people in the United Kingdom had spent the past hour watching 11 different angles of the same altercation, and had things to say about it. The black Range Rover was waiting on the tarmac, Patricia at the wheel. Patricia, who had worked for the Okafor family for 9 years, and who had at some point in the past decade become the kind of presence in Layla's life that did not require acknowledgement because it was simply reliable, a baseline comfort in the geography of a life that moved a great deal. The hot chocolate was in the cup holder, extra marshmallows arranged in the small mountain that Layla had asked for when she was 7 and had never needed to ask for again. Layla stared at the cup, and her throat did something involuntary. "Hi, Patricia," she managed. "Hi, sweetheart," Patricia said, and pulled onto the road. The flat near Oxford was a converted townhouse on a quiet residential street. 3 rooms, second-hand furniture, a bookshelf that Layla had organized in the first 48 hours of arriving as a way of making the space hers, which was a thing her mother had taught her to do in new places. There was a crowd of reporters on the pavement outside when the Range Rover pulled up, which meant someone had access to the university housing database, which was public record, which was a thing Layla had not considered when she arranged accommodation. Nathaniel made 3 calls from the car. Oxford police for the pavement outside. The university dean for the student housing database question. A private security firm for the immediate term. In 8 minutes, the pavement was clear, a university security officer was at the door, and a private guard was posted at the building entrance. Inside, Layla found Amara. Amara Osei, her flatmate, her friend since the second day of orientation, when they had both reached for the same library book at the same moment, and had laughed about it for 5 minutes and been inseparable since, had clearly been to the supermarket in a state of determined emergency. The kitchen table held ice cream in 3 flavors, chocolate in 4 forms, crisps in the British and American varieties, and a bottle of wine that was entirely appropriate given that they were in England, and it was legal, and something had happened that required wine. I bought everything, Amara said by way of greeting, and opened her arms. Layla walked into the hug and stood there for a moment, which was enough. "Are you okay?" Amara asked. "Actually okay, not English. Okay." "Ask me in a week," Layla said. "Right now I'm existing." "Existing is enough," Amara said, and pulled her toward the couch. Nathaniel left that night crisis management in New York, bored calls the machinery of consequence that needed him at its center. He held her face in both hands at the door, looking at her the way he looked at things he was cataloging completely, because he might need to remember them later. And he said, "Your mother would know exactly what to say right now." What would she say? He thought about it honestly. She would say, "You stood up. Everything else is paperwork." The BBC was running the footage when Layla turned on the television. Amara beside her on the second-hand sofa with the ice cream, and Layla watched herself on the screen, small and still in the gray hoodie seat. 1A. The calmness that she had maintained for so long that it had become its own kind of visible effort, and felt the specific strangeness of watching your own worst moment from a distance, which is both terrible and clarifying. The girl on the screen had not raised her voice, had shown her ticket, had asked 7 times for the simple procedural step of verification, had been dragged from her seat and had not screamed or fought or created the scene that would have confirmed every assumption that had been made about her. Layla watched her and for the first time felt something that was not shame. 3 a.m. in Oxford is a specific quality of silence, the kind that belongs to a university city in the early hours when the libraries have finally closed and the last cyclists have gone home and the old stone buildings settle into their own weight with something that approaches peace. Layla was at her desk, which was not peace, which was the opposite of peace, which was the place she went when her mind would not stop presenting her with things she needed to look at. The emails had found her university address public record available through the Oxford directory, 1 search away, and they had been arriving since midnight. Hundreds of them. She read them, not randomly, but methodically in the way she read case files, looking for the pattern underneath the individual. The supportive ones, first people who had experienced their own versions of this smaller and larger. The woman who had been asked to prove her child was hers at an airport in Atlanta. The man who had been told his economy ticket had been misbooked when he was clearly in first class, and the person who wanted his seat was white, and the gate agent had not asked to see either boarding pass, just assumed. Each one a data point in an argument that Layla had been constructing at some level since she was old enough to understand that the experiences she was accumulating were not random rudeness, but a pattern with a shape. Then the other ones. She read those too with the specific self-discipline of a person who believes that understanding the opposition is part of doing the work, even when understanding the opposition is unpleasant. The accusations of entitlement. The people who believed she should have moved and that not moving had been the choice that caused the harm. The detailed descriptions of what she deserved for having the nerve to stay in a seat she had paid for. She closed the laptop at 3:12 a.m. and sat in the dark. Her phone buzzed. 3:15. New York time. Her father, who also was not sleeping. They talked for an hour. He told her somewhere in the middle of that hour about her mother, about Dr. Layla Okafor, walking into the cardiology department at Columbia Presbyterian as the new chief of cardiac surgery in 2001, and being handed a parking validation form by the receptionist who assumed she was there for an appointment rather than to run the department. About the board dinner, where a man had asked Layla who she was there with, meaning which man had brought her, and Layla had said calmly and clearly, and in front of 12 people, "I'm here to chair the committee." "Chair the key. Who are you here with?" About the way her mother had understood with a clarity that came from decades of navigation that there were two choices available to a person in those situations: quiet dignity or loud accountability. And that quiet dignity, though often necessary and sometimes strategic, was only worth choosing if it served a purpose other than making the person causing the harm feel comfortable. She didn't believe in staying small to protect other people's assumptions, Nathaniel said. She believed in being exactly her size and letting the assumptions adjust. "I wish I'd gotten more of her certainty," Layla said. "You have all of her certainty," Nathaniel said. "You just wear it differently." Harrison called at 3:40 with the update on Victoria Ashworth's defamation, filing thrown out within one hearing, the judge having described it as an abuse of process legal fees of $30,000, awarded to the Okafor legal team. The text that arrived from Amara through the flat wall at 3:45 read, simply, "Heard you still up. Kettle's on." They sat in the small kitchen with chamomile tea and the kind of 4 in the morning honesty that is only available to people who are tired enough to have run out of pretense. "You know what nobody tells you," Layla said, "about the time after you stand up for yourself." "What?" "How loud it is. How many people have opinions about it. How it stops being yours and becomes everyone else's thing to have feelings about." Amara held her mug in both hands and thought about this seriously. "It's still yours," she said finally. "The part that happened to you is still yours. The part that other people are making noise about is theirs. Those are two different things." One more message arrived before morning, a passenger from row 7, a woman named Jennifer Carlisle, who had been on flight 882 and had watched and said nothing, and who had written, "I've been sitting with what I did and didn't do since I landed. I gave a full statement to your lawyer's office an hour ago. I'm sorry I was quiet when it mattered. I hope the statement helps." Layla read it 3 times. Then she wrote back, "Thank you for the statement. Speaking up late is still speaking up. It matters." She didn't sleep, but by the time the Oxford morning light started coming through the gap in the curtains, she had decided what she was going to do next. She called Nathaniel at 7:30 Oxford time, which was 2:30 in the morning in New York, and he answered on the second ring, which meant he had not been sleeping either. "One interview," she said without preamble. "My terms." She heard the specific sound of a person adjusting their position sitting up straighter. "Tell me the terms. I'm not doing this to be the face of a news story. I'm doing it because if I don't define what happened, other people will define it for me, and the definition they're working with is wrong." She had her notes in front of her, the bullet points she had drafted at 4 a.m., while the Oxford dark was doing its thinking for her. "And I want to announce the fund. The legal fund. Anyone who's been through a version of this in a travel context and can't afford to fight it, they get representation. All of the lawsuit money goes in. Every dollar." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, of the kind that had content in it. "That's your mother's daughter talking," he said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes and a half." Amara, when Layla came out of her room to find her already up and making eggs with the specific, purposeful energy of someone who had been waiting, spent the morning helping Layla prepare in the way that a good friend helps, not by offering advice, but by asking the questions that the interviewer would ask, the hard ones, the ones that require honest answers, so that Layla could find the honest answers before she was on camera rather than during. What do you say to people who think you're making this about race when it's really about a seat? Your father's response was dramatic. Some say it was disproportionate. Would you do anything differently? Layla answered each one, revised, answered again, until the answers were hers, rather than performances of what she thought the answers should be. In the afternoon, she sat with a cup of tea at the kitchen table and opened the inbox of the legal fund's preliminary email address, which Harrison had set up at her request as a placeholder. 312 messages had arrived in 36 hours. She read 40 of them before she had to stop, not because they were too much, but because they were exactly as much as she had expected, which was the specific grief of being right about the size of a problem. A woman in Dallas who had been removed from a first-class seat in 2019 and whose complaint had been closed with an apology voucher. A man in Chicago who had been asked to prove his ticket was purchased and not stolen, and who had produced documentation and been allowed to sit down and had never taken it further because he didn't know how and couldn't afford to find out. A grandmother in Atlanta who had been told twice on the same flight that her assigned seat had been given to another passenger, and who had been relocated to middle seats both times, and whose airline complaint had gone unanswered for 11 months. Each one a person who had been alone in a version of the same moment. Each one a person who had gone home with the cost of it still on them. "This is what the money is for," Layla said to Amara, who was reading over her shoulder. "Yeah," Amara said quietly. "It is." The Oxford University Library was 500 years old and smelled like it, which was one of the things Layla appreciated about it, the specific weight of that much accumulated knowledge in the architecture of a building, the way serious rooms make serious things feel appropriate to them. The Good Morning America crew set up in the reading room on the second floor, a leather chair, a small table, the kind of neutral background that puts the focus on the person rather than the setting. Robin Roberts had flown in overnight and arrived looking like a person who had slept well on planes and maintained professional composure as a biological characteristic rather than a learned one. She had said before the cameras were live to Layla, "I've watched the footage 4 times. Tell the truth and you'll be fine. You were right. You know you were right. Just say what happened." The cameras went live. The first questions were the framing ones. What happened in your own words? Walk us through it. And Layla answered them the way she answered legal questions, with precision and without embellishment, describing each interaction and each request and each refusal in the order they occurred without editorializing, which was its own form of eloquence, because the facts in sequence made the argument without needing to be argued. When Robin asked about Nathaniel's response, the jet, the fuel embargo, the drama of it, Layla looked directly at the camera and said, "My father found out that his daughter had been physically assaulted on an airplane while sitting in a seat she had paid for and had every right to occupy. He responded the way any father responds when someone hurts his child." A pause. The question isn't whether his response was proportionate. The question is why his daughter needed rescuing at all. When Robin asked about race, asked it directly, which Layla respected. Layla answered it directly. "Here's the honest question," she said. "If I had walked onto that aircraft in the same seat, with the same boarding pass, with the same documentation, but I looked different, would Bryn Calloway have decided in that first 3 seconds that I didn't belong there? I think we all know the answer. The tragedy isn't that one flight attendant had a bias. The tragedy is that no one in that cabin, no one in 12 years of her career had required her to confront it. She did not say systemic. She said instead built into the structure of how these spaces are managed. She said, a culture that has rewarded certain assumptions for a very long time without asking where those assumptions come from. When Robin asked about her mother, Layla's voice changed. Not broke changed. The way a key changes when you find the lock it belongs to. She was a cardiac surgeon, Layla said. She walked into rooms her whole life where people handed her coat check tickets instead of patient charts. She could have spent her energy managing other people's assumptions. Instead, she spent it doing her work so well that the assumptions couldn't survive it. A pause. She would have looked at what I did on that airplane and said I was too quiet. She would have said the quiet was too expensive. She might have been right. Robin leaned forward slightly. What do you want people to take away from this? Layla looked at the camera with the directness of someone who has figured out what they actually want to say. I want people to understand that there's a version of this that doesn't make the news. That happens every day to people who don't have a father who can land a jet on a runway. That costs something every time to the person it happens to, and that costs go unpaid, and the people who impose them face nothing. The legal fund I'm creating is for those people, because the right to be treated with basic dignity shouldn't depend on whether you can afford a lawyer. She held the gaze of the camera for a moment. That's all. That's everything, the interviewer said off camera after the lights came down. In 20 years, I have not done a better interview than that one, Layla said. Thank you for asking the real questions. That evening, the final 30 seconds of the interview, the answer about dignity, about the people who don't make the news, was clipped and shared across every platform and watched within 12 hours by 80 million people in 19 countries. Not because of the drama of a private jet or the scale of a fuel embargo, but because she had said a true thing simply, and true things, said simply, are the only things that travel that far. The legal outcomes arrived in the weeks and months that followed with the particular cadence of justice when it actually functions, not dramatic, not cinematic, but real and final in the way that paperwork is real and final. Bryn Calloway was convicted on theft and facilitating assault charges, received a 6-month sentence, and was permanently barred from working in commercial aviation. The conviction required her to spend a portion of her sentence conducting mandatory bias awareness sessions at airports across the country, not as punishment designed to humiliate her, but as the specific consequence of a judge who believed that understanding what you had done was part of the debt owed. By the second session, people who attended said she spoke about it without defensiveness, which might have been the most consequential change of all. Darnell Webb received a criminal conviction community service and a private letter of apology to Layla that arrived 3 months after sentencing, handwritten 2 pages specific about what he had done and why it was wrong without asking for absolution. She read it once, kept it in a folder, and did not respond, which was her right, and which cost her nothing, and which was enough. Victoria Ashworth's defamation suit was dismissed at the first hearing. Her husband's attorney filed for divorce the same week. Her social membership at 3 separate organizations quietly lapsed over the following months. None of this was engineered by Layla Okafor. It was simply what happens when a video of a person calling a teenager trash is watched by 80 million people. And the people watching it include everyone the person has ever wanted to impress. Horizon Air settled the class action, 41 plaintiff stories spanning 3 years, a pattern of differential treatment in premium cabins that the discovery process made visible in ways that internal complaints had never been allowed to make visible. The settlement was $180 million. An independent oversight committee was established with Layla Okafor holding one of the 3 public interest seats. The airline's CEO sent Layla a written apology that was 6 paragraphs long and contained not one use of the word unfortunate. Layla's portion of the settlement, $31 million, went into the legal fund in its entirety. Within the first year, the fund had supported 89 discrimination cases across 17 states. The casework employed 12 attorneys and was producing outcomes. Not all wins, but fights that would not have happened without the backing, and fights that needed to happen. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3 months after the incident, Layla was in the Oxford University Library working on a constitutional law essay, her phone face down on the desk beside her, the afternoon light coming through the Gothic windows in the particular amber angle of the autumn term. It was quiet in the way Oxford is quiet, layered and old and full of the specific serious energy of people doing intellectual work in a building that has been doing this for centuries. Her phone buzzed. Amara from the flat. You're in the BC again, third item. Layla turned the phone face down again. Then one more text from a number she didn't recognize. Hi, I don't know if you'll see this. My daughter is 16 and just got into a competitive summer engineering program. She's flying alone for the first time next month and she was scared she's been putting it off. She watched your interview last week and she said if Layla could stay in her seat I can get on the plane. She's booked. I just wanted you to know that. Layla set the phone on the desk. Outside the library window, Oxford students crossed the courtyard in the autumn light and the stone of the building absorbed it. The way old stone absorbs everything patiently without commentary as part of the long accumulation of what has happened here and been survived. She opened her laptop. Legal brief. 2 scholarship applications for the fund. A draft letter to the FAA's Passenger Rights Committee proposing 3 specific procedural changes that she had been building the argument for since August. The work was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time. But it had begun, which was the thing that mattered, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. 6 months after the afternoon at Gate 31, Layla Okafor walked into JFK Terminal 4 wearing a navy blazer and carrying a leather briefcase. And it was not a statement and it was not a performance. She was simply dressed for the destination, which was Washington, D.C., where she had been invited to speak at a passenger rights summit that the FAA was hosting partly because of the proposals in the letter she had sent in October, and partly because when you have been watched by 80 million people saying a true thing, the people whose job it is to address the truth eventually have to acknowledge that you exist. The priority lane was empty when she approached it. The gate agent was a young woman, South Asian, with the efficient warmth of someone who genuinely liked her job, and when she scanned the boarding pass, she looked up with the immediate uncalculated recognition of someone who knows a face and is glad to see it. Ms. Okafor, Seat 1A. Welcome. No assessment. No inventory of clothing. Just the simple professional welcome that had always been available and had been withheld on a July afternoon that both of them knew without needing to say. Layla thanked her and walked down the jet bridge. The flight attendant greeting passengers at the cabin door was a black woman in her mid-50s named Gloria Washington, who Layla would learn later put in a transfer request to this specific route after watching the GMA interview in October, because she had been a flight attendant for 26 years and had watched versions of what happened on Flight 882 more times than she wanted to count, and she had decided that if this particular passenger was going to fly again, she wanted to be the one welcoming her aboard. I know who you are, Gloria said quietly as Layla settled into Seat 1A. I just wanted to be here. Thank you, Layla said, and meant it in the way that small kindnesses are sometimes larger than they appear. The cabin filled around her. She opened her briefcase, pulled out the draft of her summit remarks, and was reviewing the 3rd page when movement across the aisle caught her attention. The passenger settling into 1B was 16, maybe 17. Natural hair in 2-strand twists, a backpack with a robotics club patch on the side. The particular self-contained quality of a teenager traveling alone who is managing their nerves by being very focused on the logistics of their immediate environment. Window shade, seatbelt, overhead bin. She looked at Layla the way people look when they recognize a face from somewhere and are working through the process of locating it. Then, "You're Layla Okafor." Not a question. "I am." The girl, her name, she said, was Destiny. She was flying to a regional science competition in D.C. on a scholarship she had won 3 weeks ago, looked at her with the direct, clear-eyed attention of a teenager who has something to say, and has decided to say it. "I was scared to fly alone," Destiny said. "I kept putting it off. My mom kept saying I should just book it, and I kept finding reasons not to." A pause. "And then I watched your interview. The last part. What you said about dignity not depending on whether you can afford a lawyer." Layla waited. "I booked the ticket that night," Destiny said, "because if you could stay in your seat when all that was happening, I could get on the plane." Layla looked at her at the robotics patch at the carry-on that was carefully, precisely packed at the competition entry form, visible through the mesh front pocket of the backpack, and she thought about Delia in Ohio, whose 12-year-old daughter had asked a question that Layla hadn't been able to answer in the moment but had been answering in pieces ever since. "You belong on this plane," Layla said. "You belong at the competition. You belong anywhere your work takes you." She paused. "Don't let the weight of proving that stop you from doing the work." Destiny nodded once with the specific quality of a person receiving information they intend to use. The plane pushed back from the gate. Layla turned to the window and watched the tarmac move past the same tarmac 6 months later, ordinary now in the way that things become ordinary after they have been thoroughly changed. A ground crew vehicle moved in slow circles near the fuel depot. 3 commercial aircraft were staged for departure in the morning light. Normal operations. The machinery of a day. She thought about her mother briefly and without grief the way she thought about her mother most of the time now, which was as a presence rather than an absence, a continuing influence rather than a concluded one. "You stood up." Her father's version of what Adeyeze would have said. "Everything else is paperwork." She opened her laptop. The summit remarks needed a new opening paragraph. The one she had written in October felt too formal now, too removed from the experience it was supposed to be grounded in. She deleted it and started again, writing in the direct, clear register of someone who has stopped being afraid of saying the simple version of the true thing. The right to be treated with dignity should not be a privilege. It should not require documentation or a certain kind of clothing or a father with the right phone numbers. It should be the baseline. We are here today because it is not yet the baseline. We are here today because there are 89 cases in 17 states that prove it is not the baseline. We are here today to change that. She read it back. It was right. Outside, the runway opened in front of them, and the engines gathered and the aircraft lifted. Seat 1A. Window. Exactly what she paid for. The work continues. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one. Together, we keep these stories alive.